Well, first of all, racing goes a long way back in the Ragan family. From what I understand, your dad owned a car for Jack Smith on the old Daytona Beach and Road course.
Yeah, Jack drove some early races in NASCAR for my dad. I know in 1948 at Daytona, Jack finished 8th on the beach course, and it was in Daddy's car. Daddy had gotten out of the Navy and came home after the war, and he had a mechanic shop, half a mile from our house on Highway 41, the same Highway 41 that the Allman Brothers like to sing about. But Dad had a garage there, and he took care of our family and all by working in the garage. And in the afternoons and on the weekends, he would work on his race car, and Daddy would take it and we'd go to Lakewood up in Atlanta and Central City Park in Macon, Georgia, and down to Columbus was a big NASCAR dirt track. And once or twice a year, we'd get to go to Daytona and run on the beach course, and it'd be a family trip. Now, I was a young kid back in those days, but my 2 older brothers, they remember the trips, and of course, I've heard the stories over and over and over, but Daddy, Jack lived in Atlanta, and he drove some for Daddy, and I know we've got one finishing order at home where Jack ran 8th in Daytona in 1948, and then Jack eventually moved from Atlanta up into South Carolina. My dad passed away in the 60s, but back in the 50s and up into the 60s, Daddy's like a lot of racers. He was probably racing a lot when he shouldn't have been, because it was hard to take care of the family back then and race. But one of Daddy's older drivers told me one time, a guy named Charlie Bagwell, that Daddy said, your dad loved racing. Said he used to tell me that he'd race 8 days a week if he could figure out how to do it. But he said by the time the 7th day of the week came, it started over, and he couldn't find that 8th day to go racing. But Daddy left all of that implanted in us, and I guess that's why we went racing, so to speak. My middle-aged brother that was really involved in my racing, he got out of the Navy in 1964, 65, and came home, and we even took some of Daddy's old 39 Ford and 40 Ford coupes, flathead engines, and we raced those around Middle Georgia for a few years. And then by the late 70s, early 80s, we was beginning to find out more about racing, right. And I decided we wanted to go NASCAR racing.
Now, your first date with your wife, you evidently told her that one day you'd be racing against Richard Petty. Do you remember that?
Byron Middle Georgia Raceway down in Byron, Georgia, right south of Macon, that track was built in 1966. Half mile, banked, oval. It was our super fast local racetrack. Yeah. And me and my wife had been dating in high school. We were both teenagers. And we'd go up to the Byron racetrack. Never would miss a race. Sit in the grandstand. And, I think I told her, I said, one day I'm gonna be a race car driver. One day I'm going to get to race with Richard Petty. I don't know that I ever said too much about beating Richard Petty, but I did say I'd get to race with him. But and I did. Certainly the King, and one of the reporters told me one time, said, every cup race you ran, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was in the field. So I got to race with Dale Sr. and Cale Yarber and David Pearson and Bobby and Donnie Allison and Neil Bonnet. I mean, the great ones, Harry Gant, and, just goes on and on and on, the great ones. A lot of good memories there.
Right.
And that Byron Middle Georgia Raceway is still setting today.
It is.
I've got a key in my pocket to the gate, and a friend of mine owns the property. He's in the real estate, and the half mile is still there. I take my car every so often. I stop by, drive around the half mile. There's a quarter of a mile inside on the front straightaway. And just a few weeks ago, I took one of our Legends car new drivers that needed some track time, went down, opened the gates, went down, unloaded. She run a Legends car on the quarter mile, 200 laps that afternoon.
Huh.
But the facility, the outside retaining wall's been taken down. Of course, you need to put up a soft wall because that was a super fast track. And the track hadn't had any races since 1984, November of 1984. Wow. I can tell you a story about that. J.D. Stacy was involved, Bill Cannell. But 1984 was the last races on that track. But it's still there and ran a few cup races down there.
Yeah.
So 1980, you evidently lost out at an auction for an old late model that Bobby Allison had once owned, but you still wound up with the car, from what I understand. How did that come about?
Yeah, that was a funny story. I was over at our Chevrolet dealership. My brother had closed the bank at noon that Saturday, and he always would stop by the dealership. And my wife and his wife, Joan, they had gone Christmas shopping. It was late November, as I remember. And I said, Marvin, they're having a race car auction up at Lakewood. I'll call the name of the company that had that auction every year up there with racing equipment. Let's ride up there. So we rode up there. And we're sitting in the little grandstands, and they're rolling these race cars through, and they're bidding on them. Well, a car comes through. It's red. It's got Cam 2 on it. And it was a car that Bobby Allison had run in Daytona in the Permatex race that year. And that had to have been 1981, early 80s. It had to be 81, I'd say. I've got the information at home, the bidder's card and all. We had a bidder's card. But when the car come through, another guy bought it. And I turned to Marvin and I said, that was a good buy. I mean, man, that kind of money for that car, that looked like a buy. And Marvin said, well, you should have bought it. And I said, well, so I get up and go to the concession stand, and the guy that bought the car's down there. And I get to talking to him about it. And he said, well, I said, man, that was an excellent buy. And I want to go out and look at it. And he said, well, I'd sell it. He said, I came here to sell a racing engine. The car didn't have a running gear in it. And he said, if you'll buy my engine, I'll sell you the car for what I paid for it. Well, I run up down and get my brother. He's the banker. I ain't got any money. So we go and we get together with the guy. Not only did we buy his engine, he had a tilt bed truck, a crew cab dually that you drove the car up on the back, a ramp truck. We bought his truck too, loaded it up, and I drove it back to Unadilla, Georgia. And my wife said, you did what? I said, yeah. I said, well, I didn't, but Ragan Chevrolet and my brother Marvin, bought us a race car. And we put that, I had the Chevrolet dealership. I had mechanics. I had toolboxes. I even had a front-end alignment machine, so we thought we was ready to go. Little did we know. But that's how we ended up with that race car. And I made a deal with the guy at the auction when I bought his truck, the engine, and the car, that he would come to Unadilla, help us install the engine. We didn't know all about braided lines and all. Our dirt cars and all really didn't have that back in the 60s and 70s. And we was down there running flathead Ford engines. But he came down and helped us and got it ready for the first. I made a deal with him for the first 3 races that he would help us. Huh. And he was from Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Wow.
So it's funny how that all got started, but that was the first real race car that we had ever owned.
So 1982, you did some late model sportsman and ARCA races, but Marvin evidently still didn't care for the fact that he couldn't get into the Cup garage.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that? He basically, from what I understand, the joke was he bought a Cup car so he could get into the Cup garage.
Well, that's really the truth. I had the Chevrolet dealership, and the Chevrolet dealers would work together in dealer transfer and trucks and cars. We sold a lot of trucks down in Dooley County, down at Unadilla. And I got to know Grant Adcox through the Chevrolet dealerships. His dad, a great guy, great family. They had Adcox Kirby Chevrolet in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Yeah. So I knew Grant, and I would pull for Grant. Grant would come down to Byron, Middle Georgia and race, and he'd occasionally show up at Daytona, Talladega, or somewhere and race. And so Grant told me, he said, Ken, if you're going to race and you want to be serious, you need to get some good engines. And he carried me down and introduced me to Robert Yates. This was early in my racing career, my third or fourth race. We was at Talladega. And he introduced me to Robert Yates, and what a relationship that turned into. So we're up here in Charlotte for the 300, the Saturday race, and we're parked in what I call the old ARCA garage in the infield at Charlotte. And you could walk from there through a gate if you could get by the guard, the NASCAR guard. You could get into the Cup garage. And so I've got Tommy Johnson. I brought that car up that week, like on a Monday, carried over to Harry Hyde's shop, and Tommy Johnson helped me. Tommy was Harry's right-hand guy. And we got the car ready, carried it out to Charlotte for the 300, first time I'd ever been to Charlotte. We qualified 17th. We finished 11th in that race. But so my brother wants to go from the Sportsman garage, and David Pearson's running. I think we're parked next to David Pearson, maybe out in the grass, and Bobby Allison's over there racing, and Darrell Waltrip. I think Darrell won the race. But anyway, Marvin goes, he's going to go over to see Robert Yates, and they stop him, wanted to check his credential. And he had a Busch credential in his pocket, Xfinity Today. And they wouldn't let him in. and he just couldn't buy that. So he came back to me and he said, look, the next race we go to, we're going to have us a Cup car. He said, I ain't going to be turned back and not be able to get in. So we bought one, and that was in October of like 82 or something like that. And that next year we went to Daytona for the Daytona 500 with a Buick that we bought from M.C. Anderson. M.C. Anderson was shutting down the Cale Yarber team, the Hardee's team, and we bought a Buick from M.C. Anderson, a Cup car, and we was going to take it to Daytona, and NASCAR told me that I needed to run some more races before I tried to qualify for the Daytona 500. Right. And we got Bosco Lowe to drive the car.
Ah, okay.
And made the Daytona 500 with it.
Huh.
And Bosco Lowe went down there. I believe that was in 1983. That was in 83 because 84 is when we went back in the year of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
So that had to have been in 83. And then later that spring, I drove the car at Talladega in the Cup race, made the Cup race, ran all day, took the white flag running ninth, big pack of, 15, 18 cars. Marvin's up on the spotter stand spotting for me, and all he's saying is, don't wreck it, don't wreck it. And I finished 11th. Phil Parsons, Jody Ridley passed me on the white flag lap. And we come off turn 4, and they just fanned out. I didn't know where to go. My first big race at Talladega, I'd run an ARCA race down there, NASCAR race, but we finished 11th. And Marvin said, man, we was running ninth. What happened? I said, I don't know. Sometimes things happen at Talladega in the draft, and you don't know how that happened.
That's the way it is today, too.
Yeah.
Spring of 1983, I think it was, you made your first Cup start at Atlanta. What was it like sitting there on pit road before the race and thinking, did you think, what have I got myself into? Anything like that?
That was an amazing story, too. And I tell you, we had Robert Yates' engine in the car. My brother and Robert G. were good friends. Robert G. I made good friends with Morgan Shepherd and Jeff Bodine through Robert G. Jeff Bodine was driving a Bush car for Robert G. Winning that number 8. What was that sponsor on that car? But it was a winning car. Rick Hendricks owned it.
Yeah.
Well, so we're down there, and they start the fastest 40 cars. Well, that's back in the day when you'd have 58 cars, 61 cars, 20 cars would go home. So we wouldn't stand on our time. We'd try to qualify again. So we're through qualifying. The last car to go out was J.D. McDuffie. J.D. had blown an engine that morning in practice, and Junior Johnson loaned J.D. McDuffie an engine to qualify with. This is on we'd have 3 days of qualifying. This was on Saturday morning, I believe, and the race was on Sunday. So it comes down to where J.D. had pushed out there in line. He's the last car in line. And we keep getting bumped back. And we got bumped to 38th, and then we got bumped to 39th, and then we got bumped to 40th. We're out there standing on pit road wall, and it comes down one car to go, and we're 40th on the speed chart. And I told my brother, I said, man, I got a feeling that Junior Johnson engine, we might not get to run this race. And J.D. pulled off pit road, went down the back straightaway, shifting through the gears, and something went amiss on the car, and he coasted around, come down pit road. We was in the Atlanta 500. We jumped off pit wall like you thought we had won the race. Because I had a lot of South Georgia farm guys up there, volunteer helpers that had helped me on my dirt late model, and, they were up there in their blue jeans, and I think maybe Clint Brandon seems like had bought us some white shirts to put on or something, but that was amazing that we made that race. 1983. And that was a fall race in Atlanta, our home track, and we still call Atlanta home. I got keys in my pockets to the program up in Atlanta. I'm up there every day, with the Legends Car program, and, we get to call Atlanta home, and it's been home. My dad, talking about Atlanta, in the late 50s, I-75 wasn't built till the mid-60s. We'd go to Atlanta, and we'd go up 1941, and that's the 4-lane right there in front of Atlanta. And they were building Atlanta Motor Speedway. And Daddy would stop, and we'd all be in the car going for Atlanta till we had some family up that way. And we'd walk up, and they would be grading the track, building the banks up. Took them forever, it seemed like, to build the track. And Daddy said, one day I'm going to race on that track. Well, Daddy didn't get to, but I did, and David did. And Atlanta's been our home track. We call Atlanta home. And Mike Helton, never forget the days that he was in control of Atlanta Motor Speedway. And we've got a picture at home of Mike and Adam and Davis standing by the Atlanta International Raceway pace car. It was probably taken in 88, 89. They were 4 or 5 years old. And Mike Helton was running the show. And then, of course, in 92, Mr. Bruton bought the facility and brought Ed Clark down there from Charlotte under Humpy's wing. And the rest is history. What a facility that is. And what great racing they have down there today. I don't know where Marcus and them came up with the idea of putting the banking in the track and narrowing it up to racing surface and getting NASCAR to put the Speedway package on the cars.
Yeah.
But I tell you, that is an amazing show now. And I think it's probably, I don't throw off on any racetrack. I like them all. Set up cones in a parking lot, and I like that kind of racing. But Atlanta Motor Speedway has got, in my opinion, the most exciting race from green to checkered that goes on in today's NASCAR world. It's an excellent venue, and Marcus hit a grand slam with that.
If you could not beat on the table, okay. I'm picking that up on the headset, okay. So the sound will be on it.
Show business.
Now, little birdie told me that you weren't exactly above using nitrous during qualifying. Yay or nay?
Well, I can tell the truth now. But we did. You know, I would say that there was probably a lot of rules that maybe I wasn't aware of and all, and I wouldn't dare say today that, hey, we knew nitrous wasn't to be run. But we had a nitrous kit. It was a 10-ounce bottle. And I had an engineer working on my team. He works at Robins Air Force Base today. And he was about as slick and smart as anyone I ever run across. His name was DeWitt Pascal. And Robert Yates used to love talking with DeWitt. And when it come to fabrication work and air dams and moving air and things like that, he was an amazing fabricator. Could have came up here and went to work, but he just wouldn't leave home. But he formed a nitrous bottle, that 10-ounce bottle, in the seat that he built for me. And once we left the shop, it was concealed in there. You'd had to take the seat out of the car and take the seat apart to get to the bottle. There was a small braided line that went through the roll bars up to the crossbar right at the cowl of the car, and it sprayed. It had a orifice that sprayed into the back of the air cleaner. And
now, how did you trigger it?
My push-to-talk button on the steering wheel, he had a wire that he would change just before I went out for qualifying. And I dare not touch that push-to-talk button on the steering wheel because that was a key to the nitrous bottle. And when we'd go down pit road, the last thing he'd tell me, he'd say, I'm telling you, after you take the checkered flag, you hold that push-to-talk button down and empty that bottle. You empty it. We don't want any smell, anything, any vapors or anything, coming out of this car. And I qualified with it 3 times. Daytona, once at Daytona, once at Talladega, and once in Atlanta. But, going back again, that was the days that you had 60 cars at the track to qualify. And I don't know that any team was going to the wind tunnel or any team was really had that engineered piece. What in the world the Elliots was doing up there in Dawsonville, maybe it was something to do with some of that moonshine, I don't know. But their car was like a lightning streak, at every track we'd go to, back in the mid-'80s. And they sure didn't have to worry about qualifying. Ernie had that car tuned up, and Bill and Dan had it rolling. They could set records, it seems like everywhere they went in the mid-'80s to the late '80s. But we put a lot of and it was fun and games for us. We never ran for points. We never ran really for winning. We ran because we enjoyed it. We had fun, and I can remember, qualifying that day at Talladega, and we're in the field, and we get out, we high-fiving, we having a good time, and it was all in the fun and games for us. Not that I didn't ever feel like Marty Robbins did. You remember when he run the big nitrous bottle over at Talladega?
Yeah.
And I guess he felt bad about it. And he went to NASCAR when it was over and said, hey, look, I can't take the money from these guys. I think he ran 6th or 7th, 8th or something. And he said, look, just take my money, put me to the back, or some storyline like that, I remember. I didn't feel like I was taking anything from anybody, but we had a lot of fun doing it. But actually the answer is yes, I did it 3 times, and I certainly don't need a fine from NASCAR. I hope it's
the statute of limitations.
They don't go that
good.
far. Yeah, I hope so. I hope they don't go that far back.
Yeah.
Well, you still had a pretty good speed race in Daytona back in 1984 again. I think you were 9th in the 125 and 14th in the 500. Now, you had to feel really good about all that.
Yeah, and that was the first engine that Robert Yates built with a timing belt. Up to then in the 70s, 80s, they ran a timing chain. And, of course, Robert was experimental and developing, and we would run some of his development stuff, I guess. But that engine had a timing belt. And I tell you, it was a rocket. And, they'd throw the green flag, and I could pass the front-running cars, into 10th, into 9th, into 8th, into 5th. We ran up in the top 10 or 12, and then it come time to pit. And Lord help us if we had to pit on the green, and we'd go in and pit, and we'd be running 8th and come out 23rd, even under caution, and not throwing off on my guys. But they were used to changing big old heavy tractor tires. They didn't get in a hurry putting the tire on and tightening up the lug, but they did it right. But we had a rocket that day, and I remember when the race was over, Robert told me, he said, man, you had a top 5 car. He said, that car was awesome. And I said, yeah, and it was special to us just to get to race, just to make the event, be there, and be around the people, the great racers like David Pearson and Buddy Baker and Tim Richmond. And I mean, we were just in awe. Every time we would go, it was amazing that a group of guys from South Georgia like that could show up and race. And we were in awe of the Elliots. They were always favorite survivors. We pulled for Bill Elliott as much as anybody else in the state of Georgia did. And we were just honored to get to unload a car and park in the same garage with caliber of people like that.
You talked a minute ago about Talladega. You were in that big pack of cars. You got passed on the last lap, wound up finishing 11th on the lead lap. How close was that to being a win for a team?
I could see the checkered flag. When Harold Kinder waved the checkered flag, I could see him drop the flag. Cale Yarber won the race. And they were spread out 2 and 3 wide. So I was only like 5 cars back. 5 rows back, and was a little bit closer than that until we came off turn 4 and Jody Ridley and them put a shuffle on me, Phil Parsons. But I could see the checkered flag getting ready to drop. Everybody raced across the line without getting turned around, but I don't know. That was amazing for us to run up in the front like that. After 500 miles, we could, on occasion, we could do it for a lap or 2 or 3 or 4, but for 500 miles and be there, yeah, that was a lot of fun.